Today I begin the tale, a tale woven from those stories to be told of the decades that have now passed. We start our journey in the deserts of Tempe, Arizona. I was born early a.m., roughly 8 a.m. My mother, Sarah Nelson, and my father, Daniel Sheehan, and my older brother, Daniel Paul, 3 years old at the time, welcomed me with open arms into this world. Their love and never-ending support would from that moment forth guide and inspire my journey in remarkable ways that none of us would ever have imagined. Together, we as a family would henceforth take on challenges greater than any of us could have foreseen. My name at birth, Daegan, whose meaning and usage derives from ancient Sumeria, is said to mean both protector of heaven and earth and as well little god of the heaven and earth. My name would, throughout the years of my life, come to illuminate the meaning of my path and speak to many challenges I would later face on my journey. I walked early as an infant, taking my first steps with my family's armed guards at all the doors and windows. It was Chula, Mississippi. My parents were deep in the middle of an investigation of murder trial. My parents, co-founders and leaders of the Christic Institute, were defending Mayor Eddie Carthan, the first ever elected African-American public official in Mississippi. Eddie was innocent, whereas the local officials, including the police, the courts, and local Ku Klux Klan, unfortunately most one and the same, didn't agree, and had through a criminal conspiracy, in fact, orchestrated a murder and a cover-up that these southern political and cultural factions in Mississippi were attempting to pin on Mayor Eddie Carthan. My parents and their colleagues at the Christic Institute vanquished this local racist infrastructure in one of the most famous and riveting cases in recent American history, acquitting Eddie Carthan and filing formal charges against those involved in this southern political cover-up. Returning from a victory in Chula, Mississippi, we drove back to our home in Washington, D.C. I had known D.C. as my home since I was 1 month old, essentially just old enough to fly into the heart of the beast, after having been recently born shortly after dawn under the starry skies of a new moon deep in the desert of Arizona. When I was born, my parents decided to move out of the Franciscan monastery known to those that lived under its chapeled roof, sacred halls, and beneath the light of its stained glass as the Arupa House, in which my older brother Daniel Paul had been raised throughout his early childhood before I was born. This was a traditionally styled, while no longer active Franciscan monastery that had been offered to my parents by the local District of Columbia's Catholic Archdiocese. This, of course, reflected the sympathetic nature of certain individuals within the local religious community that shared similar faith and values to those held by members of the Christic Institute, a public center for law, public policy, and the pursuit of social justice. While a beautiful communal collective, housing many of Christic staff and team for many years, the Arupa House would not be the house of my childhood. Instead, the first home my family ever purchased, just several blocks away, would become for me and my family a fortress within a strange and dangerous world, our sacred sanctuary from the crime and drug-ridden, run-down streets of 12th and Newton, Northeast DC. My mom spent her savings on our new 2-story Victorian we converted into a 3-story multi-family home for relatives and friends. This small inner-city home was always filled with love and progressive discussions of social change. In fact, I saw it to be the tip of the spear of a mystic mandate for America, a locus of intrinsic imperative, indeed, a monument of morality amidst a lost world of crime and full of corruption. As a child, I remember my family's home as a spiritually safe environment rooted in moral principle and centered around unconditional love. Days in D.C. were spent in human weather and within humble conditions. The work mattered more than the comfort or at times being comforted. I never felt unattended to, whereas my brother and I often found ourselves not attended to. This was reflected not through any lack of love, sustained sustenance, or parental care, but instead any regular form of parental oversight or street chaperoning. My parents worked late daily and all summer long near Capitol Hill across the city from where we lived. The few babysitters my parents attempted to hire as constructive forms of oversight couldn't or wouldn't last through my brother and my already entrenched sense of independence and adventure. Liberty was in our bones. Naturally, I was a great fan of freedom from a young age. Therefore, I would by day as well as by night roam far and wide across the reasonably small District of Columbia as a child. I never got lost or in too deep, mixed up with the wrong crowd or on the wrong side of town at the wrong time in the variety of neighborhoods I frequented. Whereas I did have a couple run-ins with the wrong kind of team a few times on my block, not the safest or the worst for that matter in the city. My neighborhood got very violent and quite dangerous shortly after my family permanently left the Washington, D.C. area. The Beltway and its bureaucratic beast first brought the heroin with Laos and Vietnam, then came the crack cocaine and smuggled in from South and Central America with the return of covert fascism. George H. Bush, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, recently founded by his father, Prescott Bush. This was reflected in the streets when the gangs and other young, desperate street survivors within the urban battleground shifted from the use of switchblades and shivs to handguns, Uzis, and grenades. This led to an all-out state of urban warfare between gangs that were armed to the teeth and steeped in new sources of narcotics, translating into an inner-city bloodbath depicted in gruesome scenes by night in the district, beneath the Beltway and beyond. Too many have visited the Smithsonian and Kennedy Center, and not enough have cast their eyes on such corners of the world such as Anacostia, D.C., one of the most dangerous places in America in the 1980s. But then again, Washington, D.C. was the murder and crack capital of our country at the time. Terrible it is, the drastic dichotomy drawn between the rich and the poor, the disenfranchised and the powerful in our own country's capital, D.C. is a complicated and strange place for a child to grow up, particularly for a little one whose parents are actively challenging the systemic sources of injustice that plague the families and their circumstances throughout the District of Columbia. One day I was playing in a local schoolyard near my house and decided to use the public elementary school's restroom. When I entered the boys' room, I was shocked when I saw a line of toilets with no stalls. I'm not talking urinals, but toilets. This meant zero privacy, zero human standards, zero budget for inner-city youth. Washington, D.C. is neither a state nor a city. Therefore, the district receives neither state funding from the federal government nor citywide funding from any state subsidies, leaving those of us living at the heart of the beast with very few resources or at times equal opportunity. When I was a child, I had a close friend that attended a local elementary school. One day, he came back from school and was very upset. My father asked him what was wrong, and he responded saying that in one of my classes today, my teacher asked me what I wanted to be when I got older. I told him I wanted to be a doctor or maybe a dentist. He continued by saying that the teacher was upset with me, Mr. Sheehan, and scolded me while saying, "No, son, that won't be an option for you. How about considering something more realistic like a plumber or electrician?" This was the nature of my inner city, a place on the map no one wants to account for. I find it ironic how Capitol Hill, D.C. reflects the same principles, that being their lack of accountability. Maybe the district plays the role of a dysfunctional municipal smokescreen to the Hill and its inner circles, allowing what happens behind the scenes to be as unsavory as most of the street corners in Washington, D.C. My years spent growing up in Northeast Washington taught me many things, such as respect for resilience on the part of the families and community members struggling to survive in the desperately poor and crime-ridden inner-city neighborhoods of America, and the recognition at an early age to the existence of racially rooted socioeconomic inequalities in D.C. I learned to look into the eyes of danger and not turn and run or look away out of fear. In my simple city, the days were hard, humid, and long, while the street-lit nights, still warm, seemed even longer as those regular midnight hours I spent exploring the city deep into the night grew ever more dangerous for me as the years proceeded. As time passed, I grew accustomed to encountering disposed needles and empty crack baggies strewn all over the corners of the district. For those of us native to the northeast neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. through the 1980s, the recurring sound of gunfire followed by the sound of further return fire was commonly heard across the blocks. I never heard many sirens. Police were rarely ever seen in my neighborhood on 12th and Newton. One of the only times the police ever entered my neighborhood was around 9 p.m. one night when I and a friend were messing around in the street in front of my house. Just prior to the police arriving on my street, my friend and I had seen a man run quickly past us, wearing a black jumpsuit and with a hat pulled down low over his eyes and carrying a large black duffel bag. Upon seeing him run by us, I joked with my friend, "Wouldn't it be funny," I said, "if that guy had just robbed the corner store?" We laughed lightly as we turned back to what we were doing, until shortly after we heard the approaching sound of a fleet of police sirens. It turned out that man had just robbed the store on the corner next to my house. The police quickly asked us if we had seen anyone. We mentioned what we had seen, after which I decided to go into the corner store. It appeared to me that no officers had gone in yet. Instead, they were all dispersing on foot through the alleys and backyards of the neighborhoods in pursuit of the assailant. I approached the front doors of the store, which were made of glass. As I pulled the door and began to walk through, a second gunman slammed into me, forcing me back out through the doorway in order for him to flee. As he forced himself past me, I quickly regained my balance and braced myself against the outside of the glass doors of the store. After just a few steps, he panicked, turned around, and now facing me and the entrance of the store, opened fire with a .30-57 revolver, shooting 4 rounds in my direction, each bullet barely missing me, and instead passing through the double-pane doors, as I was then braced against, as the doors were blown apart, exploding glass all around my shoulders and head. It wasn't the first or the last time I would have to come face to face with gun violence during my childhood in D.C. In the inner city, there were too many dangers in my environment for people to make it out safely before getting cut by the razor of its urban edge. From a young age, I had to learn how to fend for myself, always walk with open eyes and keep myself alive there in the lion's den. The D.C. streets were rough and rugged, riddled with trash and debris that would scavenged through by oversized sewer rats that by night would hide out behind dumpsters in backs of shadowed alleys full of broken glass. Its corners claimed as territories by dope dealers, pimps, and gunslinging gangbangers carrying common weapons such as short bats, blades, brass knuckles, sawed-off shotguns, pistols, and without a doubt the newly introduced automatic rapid-fire Uzis. The inner-city neighborhoods of D.C. were burning down from within, while just across the simple city, Capitol Hill remained full of its wealth and prestige, pompous politics, and inflated forms of ineffective diplomacy. As a result of the economic rollbacks on the part of Ronald Reagan and his alliance with Margaret Thatcher, along with the confirming verdict of the Washington Consensus, neoliberal capitalism and its drive towards creating more robust production and greater forms of profit through further privatization of enterprise was on the rise in America during the 1980s. The U.S. government was falling ever further into the hands of the ruling elite, and at that time was actively campaigning for this new capital-based geopolitical worldview by propagandizing the benefits and ultimate inevitability of free market capitalism. This concludes Chapter 1 of the Book of Souls, the Autobiography of Daegan Sheehan.